From the Times and the Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Manveen Rana. It began with a 10-second clip that went out in a BBC documentary more than a year ago.
We're going to walk down to the Capitol, and I'll be there with you, and we fight. We fight like hell.
Donald Trump, just before the January the 6th Capitol riot, seems to be directly calling for violent action. Yet that sentence was stitched together from two clips almost an hour apart. At the time, most people didn't notice the edit, but when a memo from someone investigating BBC complaints was leaked last week, all hell broke loose. The chairman of the organisation issued a formal response yesterday.
We accept that the way the speech was edited did give the impression of a direct call for violent action. The BBC would like to apologise for that error of judgment.
The leaked memo went beyond one Trump clip into wider questions about bias at the national broadcaster. And while the BBC made it clear that these issues had been investigated long before they were leaked to the press, people had been disciplined and departments restructured, it was too little, too late to save two of the most senior figures at the institution. The Director General, Tim Davie, and the Head of News, Deborah Tenness, had already resigned.
I would like to say it has been the privilege of my career to serve as the CEO of BBC News and to work with our brilliant team of journalists. I stepped down over the weekend because the buck stops with me. But I'd like to make one thing very clear. BBC News is not institutionally biased. That's why...
The BBC is in negotiations to renew its funding model from 2027 onwards. But with the US president now threatening to sue and a political pile-on building, questions about the BBC's future remain.
I really think the institution is in the last chance saloon. I'm going to defund the BBC from its current model, be in no doubt about that. You know, the BBC, under our plans, would be slimmed down to something relatively small.
The story today: can the BBC survive?
I'm Rosamund Urwin, the media editor of the Sunday Times.
Ros, take us back to Sunday evening when the news broke that two of the biggest names at the BBC were going. What was your reaction? Were you shocked?
Well, my phone started buzzing not that far ahead of the announcement, but probably because, on a Sunday paper, Sunday is not the day that everyone's contacting you, because obviously you've written your story, they contact you in the morning to talk about it, and then you get a bit of a reprieve. And I was actually out with my kids. So it was a bit slow on picking this up because I obviously had to message various bosses to say, I think something really big is coming. So yeah, when I finally got to the messages, there were a lot going, big resignation coming. And I'm afraid I initially thought it was going to be Deborah Turness. That made sense to me. And I didn't actually expect Tim Davie to go, partly because Tim Davie has clung on in the past when I've expected him to go. And actually, I looked back so that I can claim ownership of this. I was the first person in print to call him Teflon Tim, because I'd heard it, just muttered, because he just clung on against all odds repeatedly, I felt. And so I remember there was a headline on one of my pieces over the summer, one more scandal and he's gone. But I'm afraid I thought, are we right there? But we were at that tipping point then. And this was just the one, he couldn't keep going after this point. But I think with Tim, it was more of a choice to go than people might have thought, because
it did seem like even people inside the BBC and the BBC board were shocked that he was going.
Yeah, so the board had a meeting on Thursday night. The readout from that, and it's quite hard to get any sort of read across of what had quite happened there, but there was a lot of stress that the board was still on the side of Shah and Davie. And I think there is a recognition that Tim Davie was doing a very difficult job. And there are things he's done really well. I think the difficulty is it was always sort of going to come down. So there's sort of recognition that usually, and I know there is one notable exception to this, but usually it's a news scandal that fells the DG. It's usually not sort of entertainment because they're quite insulated from the rest. And ultimately, the Director General is Editor-in-Chief. And Tim always had this thing that he would get criticised for. And, I sort of see both sides on this, that he wasn't a newsman. He was not a journalist. And I think some of his judgments perhaps reflected that. He's a businessman, really. I mean, they would always say a marketing man. There were good decisions around getting the BBC ready for the future, but there were repeated errors in the news side. And there was a real failure to get a grip of those.
And Ros, for us, we love talking about media gossip. For the listeners, why is this a story that really does cut through? Why is this a story that everybody should be interested in?
Well, obviously most of us are licence fee payers, not all of us, but most of us. So we're funding this organisation. And I do think that means the BBC deserves a level of scrutiny. It's a very big institution. I think also, we are talking about global politics here. And the challenge is, in an era when you have Donald Trump saying, fake news, mainstream media, we are under even more pressure not to make big errors. The thing that I should just say, I always think about newspapers and think it's remarkable how much we get right? But there are occasional mistakes and errors that creep in because you're doing everything at great speed. And mistakes do happen, and nobody should be holier than thou because every journalist has spelt somebody's name wrong or something, got somebody's age wrong. But it's really mattered here. There's a sort of unforced error because Panorama has time to make this documentary. And to misedit his quotes like that in an era when he says, the fake news, it's really damaging because you're giving in to him. You're sort of giving him evidence. And frankly, we all have to push back from that, and that's important.
And Ros, just talk us through step by step how this scandal has unfolded.
So it broke on Monday afternoon, and I started looking at it, and I thought, oh dear, this is bad for Panorama. This is bad for the BBC. Because, you could see the misediting of the clip. So they showed you side by side immediately what the two different clips looked like.
So this was an episode of Panorama called Trump, A Second Chance, and it was broadcast just before the American election last year. And it included a clip of Donald Trump speaking on January the 6th, 2021, just before the Capitol riots. And this is a clip of what he actually said.
And after this, we're going to walk down, and I'll be there with you. We're going to walk down. We're going to walk down anyone you want, but I think right here, we're going to walk down to the Capitol. And we're going to cheer on our brave senators and congressmen and women.
More than half an hour later, still giving the same speech, he went on to add,
But I said, something's wrong here. Something's really wrong. Can't have happened. And we fight. We fight like hell.
But Panorama edited those clips together without any sign that there had been an edit, that this wasn't just how Donald Trump had been speaking. And they made it sound like this.
We're going to walk down to the Capitol, and I'll be there with you. And we fight. We fight like hell.
And that's one of the main issues referred to in this report last week.
And this is a document, so I think it's kind of wrong to refer to it as a report. It's a memo by Michael Prescott, who used to be, for a long time, the political editor of the Sunday Times many years back. And so, somebody with good and impressive career himself, who had been an advisor on editorial guidelines to the BBC, and was very, very worried about what he saw. And I think one of the important things to recognise here, because some people have said, well, this is his argument, and I think that is true. And people say, well, what about his biases when he looks at this? Well, most of his evidence is based on reports by David Grossman, who's a very, very highly regarded BBC journalist. And I should say that I did do some digging because we don't have those original David Grossman reports yet. Speaking to people who know David Grossman, and they just said how brilliant he was, really, mostly. But they also said, look, he has for a long time been critical of the BBC's coverage, for example, of US politics. And I don't think you're going to find there's this vast difference between Michael Prescott's memo and what David Grayson was writing internally for the BBC. So he is on BBC staff. So obviously he's not going to put his head, I assume, above the parapet unless he's made to. So I think that's probably really important to grasp, because first, I actually thought this wasn't getting the coverage it deserved, particularly the Trump stuff. I mean, there was an inevitability, wasn't there, as soon as President Trump started talking about it, that it would become much bigger. But earlier in the week, I was actually having the conversation of why isn't this a bigger story? Partly because quite early on, there was a view that you could say, oh, this is the Telegraph, we know they hate the BBC, and sort of dismiss it that way, which I don't think is the right thing to do in this instance, because these are legitimate concerns being raised. And I'd say particularly on the issue of anti-Semitism and, the coverage of trans issues, both of those things which have been widely talked about before.
Well, talk us through that, because, as you say, that memo included allegations about this clip, and we suddenly became aware of this edited clip of a Trump speech, but it did have other criticisms too. Talk us through what they were.
Yes, there's a series of criticisms that come up in that memo. The two that have had most attention, rightly, are issues we already knew existed within the BBC, or certainly there were concerns around. I mean, Jewish groups have been raising concerns about what they see as institutional anti-Semitism at the BBC for years now, since there was this sort of bus incident where there was an attack on a bus, and the BBC's coverage of it was, I think we can safely say, inaccurate.
On the 29th of November last year, a group of Jewish children were subjected to an anti-Semitic abuse on a bus in central London. The BBC coverage of the story was absolutely slammed by the Board of Deputies of British Jews, who complained about the alleged reporting of an Islamophobic slur on the bus.
And understandably, the Jewish community raised concerns and has been repeatedly raising concerns. So that's one of the issues looked at. And I should say, so I had a letter that had been written by 200 sort of leading people in the TV and media industry at the weekend that was mentioned in my wider reporting on this story. And, what they had to say I thought was really powerful, which is that we asked for a look into an investigation of this idea of institutional anti-Semitism. And, we've basically been ignored. What other minority group, if they were asking for that, wouldn't get it? And I did think that was really immensely powerful. And obviously Danny Cohen, who used to be the controller of BBC One, who is also Jewish, has been repeatedly raising concerns with management and with the board, and sent them another email himself on Friday, just setting out, that we can see with the Prescott memo all of these issues that, to be honest, we knew were there, or we knew there were certainly concerns around, and he's set them out in great detail. And I should say, some of this predates the conflict in Gaza, but obviously that has sort of fueled all of this conversation.
And the conflict in Gaza has been a real lightning rod for criticism for the BBC, actually from both sides.
On both sides.
Yeah, a lot of
Yes.
people who are pro-Palestinian have felt that the BBC hasn't done their job or has been biased against them.
Yes, absolutely. And I should say, yes, absolutely on both sides. So just to be clear, these are not, what I'm about to say is not my opinions, because I think that's important to state. On the pro-Palestinian side, people say the coverage, and I should say it's incredibly difficult to report on Gaza because there's a lack of access. On that side, what they say is that the lives of, for example, the hostages are covered in a way that, or the deaths of hostages, as there have been many, were covered in a way that deaths of Palestinians weren't. There is a lack of sort of equality in the treatment of the different groups' lives, right? Fundamentally, that Israeli lives, this is their perception, Israeli lives are treated as more important. And then on the other side, there's all sorts of issues, I should add, with BBC Arabic specifically, letting on people who have expressed profoundly anti-Semitic opinions and are widely known for that. So that's an issue. But it's broader than that at the BBC, in the eyes of many in the Jewish community and people who support Israel, that they feel the BBC, in its criticism of Israel, treats it very differently from how it would treat any other country at war and, living beside people that, in their view, want them dead.
And one of the other subjects that comes up for criticism is gender. Talk us through that.
Again, this is an issue that has affected the whole media. But Michael Prescott's view, was that a sort of small cabal of people at the BBC had taken over. So you couldn't get stories that were, I don't want to say anti-trans, but were expressing concerns around trans issues. You couldn't get them at all into BBC outlets. And when they did, they got very, very heavily criticised. Internally, I mean. And this is the other thing. This is not new. You know, lots of us have reported on this over and over again. The perception was, you know, the BBC also hired an LGBT correspondent, which, you know, in itself, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But they've got to sort of see the whole picture, haven't they, as with any subject. And there is an opposite side, and that view wasn't being heard.
So those are the main three criticisms in that memo. When that memo goes public in the Telegraph, how does the BBC respond?
Well, publicly, horrifically slowly. You know, the response was, we don't respond to leaks. Frankly, I thought it was pathetic. That's not a way to get a grip on a situation, particularly as this is now, you know, repeated scandals. You'd think they'd know to get on the front foot. So that's publicly. Now, internally, I was being told that Tim Davie and Samir Shah were sort of looking very, very worried, although actually all of last week, although I did get somebody saying actually they looked remarkably calm on Friday, considering that would just be Tim. I doubt that person had seen Samir Shah. But they didn't respond fast enough. They didn't seem to acknowledge that it was enough of an issue. I was told that the feeling was, well, the Telegraph doesn't like us. Telegraph's obviously widely known to be a right-wing newspaper, so would sort of ignore it and hope that it goes away. I mean, that's just never the way, I would argue, for the BBC to handle a scandal, because it just gets bigger then. People told me that Tim Davie was basically in hiding, was their way of saying. I mean, this is BBC journalists saying that to me. So look, they didn't get on the front foot, and as soon as the Commons Select Committee, which is the Culture, Media and Sport Committee, got involved, Samir Shah was told he had until Monday to publish a response. And at that point, the BBC sort of decided, well, you've got to wait until Samir speaks on Monday. And I did actually say, when I had my conversation in the press office on Friday, I said, well, it's not much help to me on a Sunday paper, is it? Like, wait for Samir.
In the background, we keep hearing that the board was getting involved at this point. So just explain, who are the board? How are they appointed? And what's their role in all of this?
The chair of the board is Samir Shah, who's done the job for about 18 months, and he is a political appointment. So he was appointed by the last Tory government. And some of the other non-executives are also appointed by the government, and some other members are appointed by the board. Damon Buffini is the deputy chair. Now, he's a businessman. And then obviously one of the most high-profile members is Robbie Gibb, who used to work for Theresa May when she was Prime Minister. And before that was a senior BBC journalist on the TV side. But they're a mixture of people. One thing that's come up repeatedly from BBC journalists is that there aren't enough journalists on that board anymore. The board was slimmed down a bit under Tim Davie. It's sort of, the perception was that Tony Hall, who's a previous Director General, put too many people on it.
And what's the board's role in all of this, and how do they get involved with this particular row?
Some people might think they should have done a bit more. I certainly heard that this week. You know, their role is to ensure that they are fulfilling the missions of the BBC and that sort of strategic direction. But what they don't want to overdo, they don't want to be micromanaging. I think that's the issue, that they shouldn't be micromanaging small editorial things. Because you have to think a lot about the reputation of the BBC. And obviously they have to think whether the BBC is giving licence fee payers value for money. And they have to think about how we assess whether the BBC is doing the things it should be doing. But they shouldn't be having to get involved in tiny little details like that. However, one of the points that I think hasn't been drawn out enough in the past week is that Samir Shah and actually Robbie Gibb both sit on the editorial guidelines subcommittee, that's the right word, which Michael Prescott reported to. So did Tim Davie. So among the people who are members of that committee, we have Tim Davie, Samir Shah, Deborah Turness, and Robbie Gibb. And I think maybe that hasn't been drawn out enough.
So these are all people who would have been aware of those criticisms, of those complaints.
Yes.
And a lot sooner than we were before they were made public. And yet they don't seem to have responded to them.
Well, they have in some places responded, and that's part of Michael Prescott's point, is that he was flagging these issues. and he wasn't really being listened to, or he felt he wasn't being listened to. And for example, with the Trump one, according to his memo, and I should say the BBC hasn't really pushed back on this point, but according to his memo, he raised it, and Deborah Turnus sort of defended the edit, saying, well, this committee in the US, which is quite a Democrat-dominated committee, found that Trump had, sort of incited things. Obviously, that wasn't the finding in court eventually. And then secondly, Jonathan Munro, who is, or was rather, Deborah Turnus's deputy, he said, we always edit things about it. Essentially, I'm paraphrasing. Now, that really isn't acceptable. But we do have some of their responses, at least as Michael Prescott has raised them. One of the things I do want to mention, because I don't think this has been covered enough, is that Tim Davie, I have sources who told me as late as Tuesday of last week, he was still defending the edit, saying, we edit things. That's the normal process of journalism. So he didn't grasp at first how bad this was going to be. And I think he thought this was survivable last week.
Obviously, it all got much worse when the President of the United States of America, Donald Trump, wades in. His spokesperson also makes statements criticising the BBC over this. And soon you have domestic politicians. You have people like Boris Johnson adding to the clamour. At what point do you think, was it sort of disputes with the board? Was it just how bad it was becoming in terms of the publicity outside the BBC? At what point did it become clear that somebody would have to resign? Some head would have to roll?
My personal view is I thought on Wednesday someone's going over this. But there's an expression that I've often quoted in pieces that a wonderful long-term BBC lifer told me once, which is, oh yes, deputy heads must roll. And it's the idea being that the buck usually stops with somebody a couple of rungs down. And at that point, I started thinking, well, it might be Turnus's deputy, Jonathan Munro, but it might be Turnus herself. And as the week went on, I started to think the problem with Turnus going, in my mind, was that Tim Davie had appointed her with great fanfare. Got this brilliant newswoman who'd worked previously at ITN and then gone out to America. So she'd only started in 2022. So she's done actually a relatively short tenure in that role. And she'd got this grand title of CEO of News, which her predecessor didn't have that title. And she's very well paid for that role. I was starting to think it's got to be her by the end of the week. And I'm afraid that's how I wrote it, thinking that Tim would stagger on because he'd always staggered on before. But I thought that would have reflected really badly on him because he hired her. He made great noises about hiring her. And they did seem like quite a sort of unit.
So he had to go.
And so he went. Yeah, he went too. I mean, maybe he just thought, I've had enough of this. I'm going to go out and make a lot more money in America. That's plausible. Well, I should say that all of his friends have always said there's another job in him. He doesn't see the BBC as the final job. He thinks there's one more role in him after this. He's not actually that old. He's got a bit of a career ahead of him. Maybe go now before things get any worse.
Ros, this was the latest in a long string of scandals. You mentioned, you sort of coined the term in print of Teflon Tim. There had been a number of incidents before this. Just run us through a quick list of recent BBC problems.
Okay, so under Tim's watch, the first thing that kicked off was the Martin Bashir scandal. Now, to be clear, that predates him by a long, long way. Nothing to do with him in theory.
This was the panorama with Diana.
So Martin Bashir got the panorama interview with Princess Diana many, many years ago, 25 years ago when we first brought it in. It's now 30 years ago. 30 years ago, he got it using very insane levels of deception. The difficulty is that Tim Davie did not get to grips with the scandal. What he could have done is said this happened under the watch of previous director generals, previous bosses, but I think he felt obliged to protect his immediate predecessor, Tony Hall, who had been in a senior news role at the time of the Martin Bashir scandal and, had levels of awareness that has since emerged about Bashir's deceptive means and certainly didn't look into them in the way he should have done. So that was scandal one, very quick into Tim Davie taking over at the BBC. And then we've had a succession of ones around people's behaviour, especially. I mean, there's so many, but Hugh Edwards,
See, within the past few minutes, former BBC News presenter Hugh Edwards has pleaded guilty at Westminster Magistrates Court to 3 counts of making indecent images of children. Here,
there's scrutiny of Russell Brand's behaviour. Well, he was a DJ at Radio 2. Obviously, Greg Wallace at MasterChef.
We start with breaking news about the TV presenter Greg Wallace. The production company behind MasterChef has published its investigation into allegations of misconduct against the TV star, specifically regarding inappropriate comments and behaviour made against its former presenter.
Now, some of these are less tied to the BBC because, maybe they're very historic, or in Greg Wallace's case, there's an external production company for MasterChef. But there certainly was awareness in that case among BBC bosses that his behaviour had crossed various lines. And with the case of Hugh Edwards, that was their most senior news presenter. I don't think we can underplay, how sort of damaging that was to the BBC. The BBC used to roll him out to sort of lecture the nation on how he knew what to believe. And so that was really damaging. But I think you can accept that any institution has bad apples, right? It's how you root them out and how you deal with them. But that was a mishandled scandal because they knew that there had been a succession of complaints about Hugh Edwards when it all kicked off. Yeah. They already knew that and they sat on them and they didn't make that clear at first. This year, we've had most recently Glastonbury, which was fairly disastrous.
Free! Punk rap duo Bob Vylan's performance on Saturday condemned as appalling hate speech by the Prime Minister.
But have you heard this one, though?
Chanting free, free Palestine and then death, death to the IDF, referring to the Israeli military.
The Bob Vylan broadcast of phrases such as death to the IDF, and actually naked anti-Semitism before that, where he talked about music managers in a sort of very, very offensive way, where he was implying sort of Jewish money. And before that, the Gaza film, which was the one in which a young boy who it turned out was the son of a Hamas official, but he was the voice of it, narrated it. And look, you can get lower level scandals, but I do think some of these are very reputationally damaging for the BBC. And, they just didn't get on the front foot of these issues.
Ros, could this be the end of the BBC? We know the licence fee is always being negotiated. We've had a stream of disasters now. We've had 2 huge resignations. Can the institution survive this?
Yeah, the BBC has weathered worse things, I'd argue, than this. As bad as this seems, the Savile scandal was on another level, frankly. And it has survived Director Generals going. And so, look, it's survived periods of great instability, partly because it has brilliant people working for it. It has brilliant journalists, a lot of them. And they want this sorted out too, because, it's their reputations too. I think the challenge is what happens if Nigel Farage wins the next election. At the moment, Nigel Farage has very successfully used the BBC. But if he's Prime Minister, I can't imagine that he will feel a loyalty to them to protect them in any way. And the Labour government certainly feels it should protect the BBC. I don't think it's got the will that it should have done to reform the licence fee. I think that should have been a major goal of, on the sort of culture brief, Lisa Nandy's brief. She should have looked very hard at different options because the licence fee looks outdated in 2027. But what's it going to look like in 2037? It's going to look like this ludicrous old system. And other countries have acknowledged that and reformed their licence fee and found different ways of funding their national broadcaster. And unfortunately, I don't think we're going to see that happen, which actually I think puts the BBC in a worse position long term. So there's a lot happening. And I think that it will be very important that they find the right person to come in as the Director General post Tim Davie. And actually really important who they hire as head of news as well, because they need to do a sort of grassroots, bottom-up reform and look at everything and just ensure that it's doing what it should be doing. And I think that the worst thing for them is if they really have damaged trust this week, and I suspect they have. The BBC always rests on the thing of saying, well, actually, we're still the most trusted news organisation. And I don't know if that's what's going to be found when they next do that survey anymore.
The BBC has issued a statement making it clear that complaints were investigated and dealt with throughout the period highlighted in the leaked memo. They say they've published corrections where they've got things wrong, changed editorial guidance to make the BBC's position on issues clearer, made changes to leadership where the problems point to underlying issues, and carried out formal disciplinary measures. We've been hearing from the Sunday Times media editor Rosamund Urwin. There's more coverage of this story at thetimes.com. The producers today were Edward Drummond, Shabnam Grewal and Harry Stott. The executive producer was Kate Lamble. Sound design was by David Crackles and theme composition was by Mal Lassetto. If you'd like to get in touch with us about this or any other episode, do drop us a line to thestory@thetimes.com. Thanks for listening. We'll be back tomorrow.